In the last episode, we finally got this twin turbo 300ZX running for the first time since 2016. But we still hit some roadblocks. It was smoking a ton and I let it idle and it didn't die off. But today we're gonna find out if this engine's even viable by doing a compression test. When a car like the 300ZX starts smoking, it usually means a couple of things. It's either burning coolant, oil, or a combination of the two. And coolant or oil getting into the combustion chamber usually means you either have a bad head gasket, problem with your timing or your valves, or you have a problem with the components of the motor like worn piston rings, cracked cylinders, things like that. But another likely culprit on these 300ZXs, especially after sitting for so long, would be the turbos. As they sit, the turbo seals wear down and coolant and oil can get into them, pushing oil and coolant through the intakes and right into the combustion chamber. So the compression test is going to let us know if our head gasket and our actual engine is good before we rule it out and move on to the turbos. To perform the compression test, we have to remove all the stuff that we just installed to get this thing started, like the coil packs, spark plugs, and things like that. That way we can install the compression tester onto the cylinder and see if this engine is healthy or not. After pulling the spark plugs, I'm already seeing something interesting. It looks like the plugs are showing signs of oil fouling, which matches the smoke that we're seeing out of the exhaust. Now for the compression test, the minimum number we want to see is 125 PSI. But from factory, these cars come with 170 PSI, and this car has 150,000 miles. But really the main thing that we're looking for is we want to see the differential between the cylinders less than 10 PSI. If the number between the cylinders gets too great, that means you have a bigger problem, even if you have compression that's within spec. So say for example, you have 125 PSI in one cylinder, and you have 150 in another cylinder. Even though you met the minimum of 125 PSI, the differential being 25 PSI means that you have a bigger problem. So more important than the number is consistency within the numbers between all the cylinders. Before we start the compression test, we want to remove the fuel pump relay. That way we don't end up flooding the cylinders as we're doing this. From there, I screwed in the gauge into the cylinder and now it's time to test. So all 6 cylinders came in between 150 and 160 PSI, so that means we have a healthy motor. But that likely means our turbos are bad, which on this car, you definitely don't want to do a turbo job with the engine in the car. Plus, while working on this car, I've noticed a crazy amount of leaks on this car. And most importantly, we got to get this automatic transmission out of here. So if we're pulling the transmission, it's not that much work to get the motor out as well. But before we dive into pulling this motor, I think it's best we go grab some lunch. With lunch out of the way, now we can get back in the garage and get this car on the lift so we can get this slot box out of the car. Since the ceilings in my garage are pretty low, I'm using a quick jack lift. This is like a mid-rise lift. It goes up a few feet in the air and it's perfect for this. First thing I did was start to disconnect the wiring harness from the motor. We're gonna leave this with the car. And then from there, I started disconnecting all the vacuum lines and coolant lines and anything that was attached from the body to the engine. I disconnected and removed the battery. This is gonna free up some space, but it's also gonna let a lot more daylight in from underneath the car so we could see a lot better when we're working underneath there. Now we can start attacking the fluids. I jumped underneath the car and drained out the radiator so we could start disconnecting all the coolant lines as well. And a lot of the fluids will tell their own story about this car, so we can analyze those and get a good idea of what's going on inside. The coolant looked like Italian bread service. There was transmission fluid floating in it, likely from the cooler. The more I disassembled the car, the worse it got. When I pulled out the coolant pipes, this is what I saw. Likely at some point somebody put some stop leak into the cooling system, which is not a good sign. And almost always one of the worst parts about removing an engine is removing the exhaust. So I just went ahead and cut this one off since the bolts were so corroded. I didn't even attempt to remove them. Once I cut it out, I drug it out like a dead body. And like everything else with this car, things just got worse. There were holes rusted completely through the muffler and the tailpipes. Next to come out was the drive shaft. And from there we could finally get this automatic transmission out of this car for good. transmission finally out of the car, now we can say goodbye to being underneath the car, which is by far my least favorite part about working on cars. I hate being upside down, and also it's always a little bit sketchy being underneath the car at home. So now we can go back around front and get the cherry picker out. To give myself as much room as possible with the cherry picker, I took off the front fascia and the front bumper, and this will allow me to get the cherry picker in a lot closer. And I'm just going to be lifting the engine straight off the intake plenum, so I wrapped a chain around the first two runners, and then I hooked it up to the cherry picker. Then I started pulling the engine out. Every couple of inches I went around and checked for all the little things that I forgot to disconnect. And just like that, the engine is right out of the car. And for how much people like to advertise these things being hard to work on, it honestly wasn't that bad of an engine pull. But the job's not finished. We have to get the flex plate off and put this thing on the stand, which is arguably the most sketchy part about pulling an engine from a car. We conquered the beast, so now it's time for the fun. We get to start cleaning everything up, replacing everything with new items. We're definitely going to be doing a new wiring harness, and as you can see, there's a ton of leaks in this engine bay, so we're probably going to need all new hoses, and my goal is to pretty much make this thing brand new. And even though the engine is healthy, it's definitely seen better days, so we're going to strip this thing all the way down and rebuild it from the ground up. And now my garage looks like an Autobot explosion. We've got parts everywhere. I think this is a good stopping point where we can start to clean up and reorganize everything and get a fresh start. So we'll probably start off by stripping down the rest of the engine bay and cleaning everything up, and then stripping down the actual motor. From there, we'll take a trip down to Concept Z Performance and we'll order all the parts brand new, which is not going to be cheap. But I think on a car like this, if you do it right and you actually do a good job restoring it, you'll get your money back in the future. It's not a good investment by any means, but at least it's not like throwing money down the toilet. And I think with my skill set and my taste, I'll be able to take this car to the next level and make it one of the best Z32s that are out there. So if you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe button, drop a like on the video if you want to, and I'll see you guys next week.